Miss Marple and the Echo from the Cellar. Chapter 1. The Summer Fete at Elmsworth. The village of Elmsworth lay basking in the golden warmth of a late June afternoon. Roses tumbled over garden walls, bees hummed in the lavender, and the green in front of St. Michael's Church had been transformed into a cheerful bustle of stalls, trestle tables, and bunting for the annual summer fete. It was the sort of day that made one believe nothing unpleasant could ever disturb such a place. The children darted between the coconut shy and the hoopla stall, shrieking with laughter. The vicar presided solemnly over the raffle, and Mrs. Withers, the postmistress, had already declared that her sponge cake, with its perfectly even layers of strawberry jam, would be the pride of the judging table. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably beneath a striped umbrella with a teacup in hand, smiled to herself as she watched the goings-on. She had long since learned that village events were fertile ground for observing human nature. Who spoke to whom, who avoided whose eye, whose cheerfulness rang false. The fete was, to her mind, a stage where small dramas played out unnoticed by most. From across the lawn, young Peter Trenchard, ruddy-faced and flushed with importance at being put in charge of the skittles, was in noisy disagreement with his uncle, Mr. Harold Trenchard, a prosperous man in the timber trade. Their raised voices drifted over the music of the brass band, enough for a few heads to turn. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes did not miss the tension, nor the embarrassed laughter that followed when Harold clapped his nephew on the back with perhaps a shade too much force. Nearer at hand, Mrs. Lydia Redfern, elegant in pale silk despite the heat, leaned in to whisper something to Dr. Simons, who stiffened visibly before replying with cool brevity. Lydia's husband, meanwhile, strolled nearby, affecting interest in the tombola. Miss Marple sipped her tea, concealing a thoughtful expression. People in villages, she knew, often believed their secrets well hidden. The fete continued with raffles, laughter, and the judging of cakes. It was only as the sun began to sink and the shadows stretched long across the churchyard that something odd occurred. A group of children, playing at hide-and-seek, ran shrieking past the church vestry and down the worn steps that led to the old cellar beneath the hall. The building had stood for centuries, its stone foundations cool and damp even on the hottest of days. The children's cries were merry, until they weren't. A single scream, high, sharp, and quite unlike the playful shouts before, cut through the hum of the fete. Stalls fell silent. Heads turned. Parents rushed forward. Within moments, a cluster formed at the top of the cellar steps. Two little girls stumbled out, pale and wide-eyed, clutching one another. "There's someone down there," one of them gasped. "We heard them. We heard them talking." The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. The cellar had long been unused, its doors usually locked. Mr. Harper, the churchwarden, hurried down with a lantern. His footsteps echoed eerily in the stone chamber below. After a tense pause, he re-emerged, his face curiously ashen. "There's nothing to be seen," he declared a little too loudly. "Children's fancies. Echoes, that's all." Yet Miss Marple, watching from her seat, did not miss the way his hand trembled as he set down the lantern. Nor did she fail to observe the fleeting glance he exchanged with Lydia Redfern, who quickly looked away. The fete carried on, though with a nervous undercurrent. But for Miss Marple, the day had changed. For where others dismissed the children's cries as imagination, she had seen the truth. A shadow had stirred in Elmsworth, and soon enough the village would be forced to face it. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dark. The fete at Elmsworth might have ended with laughter, but by the following morning, the entire village was buzzing with something far less cheerful. The children's shrieks about voices in the cellar had traveled swiftly through the narrow lanes and tidy hedgerows, embroidered with each telling until it seemed half the village believed a ghost had been heard beneath St. Michael's. At Mrs. Withers's post office, where letters were collected and gossip dispensed in equal measure, the story had already taken firm root. A customer could not so much as request a stamp without being given, alongside it, Mrs. Withers's latest version of events. "I tell you, Emily," she said to her assistant as Miss Marple entered to buy a spool of twine, "the poor mites were pale as milk. One of them says she heard a man's voice, plain as anything, calling from down below. And don't tell me it was just echoes. Children don't scream like that for nothing." Emily, who had been stacking tins of boiled sweets, murmured agreement. She lowered her voice when she noticed Miss Marple at the counter, though not low enough to escape her notice. Perhaps it's the ghost of old Mr. Carroway, the sexton. Died in that very church, didn't he, years ago? Mrs. Withers gave a little shiver for effect. Murdered, some said, though no one could prove it. Miss Marple accepted her twine and her change with a polite smile. She did not offer her opinion, though she remembered perfectly well that Mr. Carroway had died peacefully in his sleep after a supper of roast mutton and treacle pudding. Still, she thought it wise not to interrupt the flow of gossip. People often revealed more than they intended when speaking in whispers. Outside, the morning air was fresh, carrying the scent of cut grass and roses. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her cottage, pausing now and again to admire a well-tended border or exchange a word with passing neighbors. Nearly everyone she encountered was eager to mention the cellar. Mr. Harper, the churchwarden, passed her on the lane, his hat pulled low, and gave a curt nod. His face, ordinarily florid, seemed a little pale. Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "A most successful fete yesterday, Mr. Harper. I do hope the church funds will be much improved." Yes, quite," he said shortly, and made as if to continue walking. But Miss Marple, with the mild persistence for which she was known, added, "Though I dare say it must have given you quite a turn. The children's fright in the cellar, I mean." For the briefest moment, Mr. Harper's expression tightened, and his hand fumbled with the brim of his hat. "Children's nonsense," he said briskly. "Echoes and shadows, that's all. You mustn't put stock in it, Miss Marple." "Oh, I never discount children," Miss Marple replied mildly. "They notice things we adults prefer not to see." But Mr. Harper had already tipped his hat again and hurried away, his boots striking the lane with more force than necessary. Miss Marple continued her walk with a thoughtful air. She had lived long enough to know that when a man denied too strongly, there was usually something beneath the denial. That afternoon she paid a call on Mrs. Price, who lived opposite the church and was well known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. Seated in a parlor thick with the smell of lavender polish, Miss Marple listened as Mrs. Price held forth. "I saw them, Jane, those children, running out of the cellar as if the devil himself had chased them. And the look on their faces. You can't make that up. There was something down there, mark my words. Though whether it was man or spirit, I cannot say." "And Mr. Harper?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Price pursed her lips. "Oh, he was quick enough to hush it up. Said it was imagination, told the vicar not to make a fuss. But between you and me, I think he was rattled. I've never seen a man come up a flight of steps so fast in my life." Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed Mrs. Price to ramble on about other matters. Mrs. Redfern's new silk gown, the vicar's sermon, the questionable morals of the grocer's daughter, while quietly filing away the details that mattered. When she returned home that evening, the village lay still under the fading light. Yet the peace felt fragile, like a surface ready to crack. She sat by her window with her knitting and reflected. The villagers might chatter about ghosts, but Miss Marple trusted in human nature rather than the supernatural. Someone had been in that cellar. Someone with a reason for being there, and a reason for not wanting to be discovered. The echo the children heard had not been of the past, but of the present. And though she could not yet put her finger on it, Miss Marple felt a faint stirring of unease. Long years of observation had taught her to heed such feelings. Beneath the roses and lace curtains of Elmsworth, a shadow was lengthening, and she suspected it would not be long before tragedy followed. Chapter 3. The Quarrel. The morning after the summer fete dawned with a deceptive brightness, the sort of golden light that seemed determined to wash the village of Elmsworth clean of all unease. Children skipped down the lanes, milk was delivered with the clink of bottles, and the chimneys breathed out the familiar blue wisps of coal smoke. To any casual visitor, the village looked as peaceful as a painting. But beneath the surface, there was already an undercurrent of whispered speculation about the strange sounds in the church cellar. At the Trenchard household, however, peace was far from the order of the day. Harold Trenchard stood at the head of the breakfast table, staring down at his nephew with the sort of expression that was half sternness and half disgust. The room smelled faintly of fried bacon and strong tea, but neither man seemed inclined to enjoy the meal. "I've had just about enough of your insolence, Peter," Harold said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. You treat responsibilities as though they were trifles. You've no head for business, no sense of loyalty to family. You flit about as if the world were a pleasure ground. Peter Trenchard, seated with his chair tipped back slightly, folded his arms and returned his uncle's glare with a defiant calm. He was a handsome young man, perhaps too aware of it, with a manner that suggested both charm and recklessness. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, uncle," he said, his tone cool, "but I refuse to chain myself to a desk simply to preserve your sense of order. The estate is suffocating, and I for one will not live the rest of my days pandering to village committees and parish councils. I intend to live as I please." Harold's fist struck the table so that the teacups rattled. "Live as you please? On what? You've squandered your allowance on debts and idle company. And now you expect me to fund your foolishness further? No, Peter. That ends today." The quarrel might have continued in this heated rhythm for hours had it not been for Lydia Redfern, Harold's niece by marriage, who slipped quietly into the room. She was pale this morning, her fair hair drawn back severely, her eyes darting between the two men. "Must you argue so at breakfast?" she said softly. "The servants can hear you. Half the village will know by noon." "That boy needs to hear the truth, Lydia," Harold said curtly. "And if the servants gossip, let them. I will not have idleness under my roof." Peter rose abruptly, sending his chair scraping against the tiled floor. His voice was low but edged with venom. "Perhaps it's not idleness you fear, uncle. Perhaps it's the thought that someone might challenge your tyranny. Well, you've controlled this household long enough. One day people will see you for what you are." The words hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot. Lydia gave a nervous laugh, trying to ease the tension, but Harold's face had gone an ominous shade of crimson. "You insolent pup," he muttered. "If you dare speak to me like that again." Peter did not wait for the threat to be completed. He snatched his coat from the rack and strode from the house, slamming the door so violently that the breakfast china trembled once more. The quarrel did not remain private for long. By midday, fragments of it had reached the ears of several villagers. Mrs. Withers, the postmistress, recounted to anyone who would listen how she had seen Peter marching down the lane with a thunderous expression, muttering to himself. Old Mr. Cobbler, the blacksmith, added that Harold Trenchard had been heard bellowing from his window not an hour earlier, shouting words that suggested a complete severing of ties between uncle and nephew. Miss Marple, who happened to be sitting in her neat garden knitting when Mrs. Price-Davies stopped by with the latest tidbit, merely pursed her lips thoughtfully. "It is often so," she murmured, "that families quarrel most bitterly when they believe their fortunes are at stake. I recall a case in St. Mary Mead where a nephew, very like young Peter, was accused of all manner of mischief, though in truth his uncle was hardly a model of restraint. Yes, yes. One must look closely at such tempers." Mrs. Price-Davies, who had hoped for a more sensational reaction, went away faintly disappointed. That afternoon, Harold was seen in the village square, speaking with the vicar, Reverend Pritchard. He was calmer by then, though his voice carried clearly in the still air. "I tell you, Pritchard, I won't tolerate it any longer. The boy is a disgrace. If he cannot be made to see sense, I shall cut him off entirely. Let him fend for himself." The vicar, a mild man with thinning hair, raised his hands in gentle protest. "Now, Harold, do try to show patience. Youth is ever rash. Peter may yet mend his ways." Harold snorted. "Not likely. Mark my words, Pritchard. That boy will bring nothing but shame upon this family. If it kills me, I'll see him corrected." The last words, though uttered in a moment of temper, seemed to chill the air between them. By evening, Peter was nowhere to be found in Elmsworth. Some said he had gone to Marleycombe to play cards with questionable friends. Others insisted they had seen him near the river, staring moodily into the water. Lydia remained silent on the matter, though more than one villager noticed her anxious glances whenever Peter's name was mentioned. Miss Marple, knitting steadily by her lamplight, thought long and carefully about it. She had watched quarrels of this kind before. To others they seemed like everyday family disputes, but she knew better. Words once spoken could fester and grow until they bore fruit of the darkest kind. And when, 2 nights later, Harold Trenchard's body was discovered in the church cellar, The memory of that breakfast quarrel would become the village's first and loudest piece of evidence. Chapter 4. Shadows Behind Smiles. The morning after Harold and Peter's quarrel seemed unnaturally still, as though the very air of Elmsworth held its breath. The sun shone politely through lace curtains, the sparrows hopped dutifully on the cobbled street, and yet there was a thin undercurrent of unease that had not been there before. Villagers carried it in their glances and in their lowered voices, though no one admitted as much. At the Redfern cottage, Lydia Redfern was setting out a tray of tea when she caught sight of her reflection in the polished teapot. Her face, though still lovely, looked drawn and tired. A sleepless night had left its mark, shadows beneath her eyes, and a tremor in her hands she could not quite steady. She sighed, adjusted her blouse, and stepped into the sitting room, where Dr. Edmund Simons was waiting. The doctor rose when she entered, his tall figure a shade too stiff, his smile too carefully arranged. "You look pale, Lydia," he said softly. "Has something troubled you?" She hesitated a fraction of a second before replying. "No more than usual. It is only the heat. You know how I dislike it." But Dr. Simons's gaze lingered upon her longer than courtesy required, and Lydia, suddenly conscious of it, turned away under the pretense of arranging flowers. Meanwhile, across the village, Miss Marple was paying a call on Mrs. Price-Davies, who had been stricken with a mild attack of rheumatism. The two ladies sat in the parlor with a plate of currant scones between them, while the conversation, inevitably, turned to the Trenchards. "They say young Peter stormed off after breakfast yesterday," Mrs. Price-Davies confided, lowering her voice as though the wallpaper might carry tales. "Such dreadful language he used, I hear. And Mr. Trenchard, red as a beetroot. Oh, I do pity Lydia. To be caught between them like that." Miss Marple nodded gently, her knitting needles clicking in quiet rhythm. "Yes, family quarrels are often hardest on the women. They must smile and pour tea as if nothing were amiss. But one must look beyond smiles sometimes. They can hide very deep sorrows indeed." Mrs. Price-Davies blinked, as if the idea were altogether novel, before launching into another account of Peter's debts. But Miss Marple had already filed the remark away, as neatly as she would fold a pressed handkerchief. By afternoon, gossip had spread beyond the quarrel itself to the people surrounding it. Lydia Redfern was seen walking hurriedly through the square, her eyes downcast, her manner anxious. More than one villager noticed that Dr. Simons happened to pass the same way not 5 minutes later, pausing to watch her turn the corner. Mrs. Withers, who prided herself on seeing everything from her post office window, was the first to remark upon it. "There's something between them, you mark my words," she told Mr. Cobbler, who had come in for a packet of stamps. "A woman doesn't avoid a man like that unless she has a reason. And a man doesn't stare unless he's got one too." Mr. Cobbler grunted, pocketing his stamps. "More likely she owes him money for medicine. You see romance where there isn't any." Mrs. Withers sniffed. "Medicine, indeed. I know what I know." That evening, at the vicarage, Reverend Pritchard hosted a small gathering for the church council. Lydia attended with Harold, her smile carefully fastened in place like a brooch. She poured tea, passed sandwiches, and laughed softly at all the right moments. To the casual eye, she was the very model of composure. Yet Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner with her crochet, saw what others did not. She noticed the faint trembling of Lydia's hands whenever Harold addressed her sharply. She noted the fleeting glance exchanged between Lydia and Dr. Simons when their eyes met across the room, a glance quickly broken but telling in its swiftness. Harold, oblivious or perhaps uncaring, dominated the discussion as always, arguing about the repair of the church roof. His voice rose and fell like a hammer on iron, brooking no contradiction. When Lydia, in a rare moment of courage, suggested a less costly solution, Harold dismissed her with a curt, "The matter is not for women to decide." The smile stayed upon her lips, but Miss Marple, watching closely, saw the pain flicker behind it. Later that night, when the council had dispersed, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the lamplit streets. She passed the churchyard, where shadows stretched long across the graves, and paused a moment by the lych gate. From somewhere within the darkened church she thought she heard a faint sound, like a door creaking, or perhaps the echo of a step upon stone. She listened intently, but when it did not repeat, She resumed her way. At home, she sat by her fire, the flame casting gentle warmth over her lined face. She thought of Lydia's smile, so bright on the surface and so thin beneath. She thought of Dr. Simons's too careful politeness, of Peter's stormy departure, of Harold's booming voice filling every room he entered. Yes, she murmured to herself. Shadows behind smiles. One must watch very closely. It is often there that the truth first shows itself. She set her knitting aside, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. But long after the village had settled into sleep, Miss Marple lay awake, her mind quietly piecing together the puzzle that others did not yet know existed. Chapter 5. The Body in the Cellar. Sunday morning in Elmsworth dawned with the solemn quiet that always accompanied the Sabbath. Church bells tolled gently across the valley, summoning villagers to worship, their notes drifting on the crisp air like a benediction. Families filed along the lanes in their best attire, hymn books tucked under arms, children scrubbed and polished until they gleamed. To outward appearance, it was a day like any other. Yet beneath the surface, unease stirred like a shadow in the sunlight. People still whispered about the quarrel at the Trenchard house, and about Lydia's anxious demeanor at the council meeting. But it was not until after the service, when the congregation spilled out into the churchyard, that the first note of true alarm was struck. The vicar, Reverend Pritchard, had gone down into the cellar of the church to fetch a box of candle stubs left from the fete. He was expected back within minutes, but when he did not return, Mrs. Withers remarked, loud enough for all to hear, that he was probably dawdling. Her words had hardly left her lips when a cry rang out from the depths below the vestry. It was not the vicar's voice. It was the voice of young Thomas Hill, the sexton's son, who had gone to assist. The cry was shrill, ragged, filled with terror. "Help! Come quick! There's a body down here!" The effect was instantaneous. Parishioners who had been chatting amiably froze where they stood. Women gasped, clutching their gloves to their mouths. Several men rushed forward, among them the blacksmith, Mr. Cobbler, and the doctor, Edmund Simons. Miss Marple, though frail in body, was not far behind, her sharp eyes keenly alert. The cellar lay beneath the vestry, a stone chamber cool and damp, smelling faintly of mildew and candle wax. Light from a single lantern flickered against the walls, throwing long, shuddering shadows. There, sprawled at the base of the stone steps, lay Harold Trenchard. His head was twisted at an unnatural angle, his arms flung wide, as if in one last gesture of protest. The stillness of death clung to him more heavily than the damp air. Dr. Simons knelt at once, placing 2 fingers against Harold's throat. After a moment, he withdrew his hand and shook his head gravely. Dead. His neck's broken. A murmur swept through the assembled villagers. Mrs. Withers fainted into the arms of Mrs. Price-Davies, who herself looked perilously close to collapse. The vicar stood pale and trembling, his lips moving in silent prayer. Miss Marple, however, merely tightened her shawl and peered down with sharp, bird-like attention. Her eyes flicked from the broken lantern on the steps, to the smear of mud on Harold's shoe, to the faint bruising already visible along his temple. "It looks like an accident," Dr. Simons declared, his voice firm but uneasy. "He must have tripped on the steps and fallen. These old cellars are treacherous places." But even as he spoke, the words rang hollow. Too neat. Too convenient. Young Thomas, pale as milk, stammered, I only came down to fetch the candles. I saw him. He was just lying there." The villagers looked at one another, faces pale in the lantern's glow. An accident, yes, but whose whisper would not add, or something worse. And then, from the doorway above, a figure appeared. Peter Trenchard, his face flushed, his hair disheveled as though he had been running. "What's happened?" he demanded, his voice echoing harshly in the stone chamber. His eyes fell upon the body of his uncle, and he stopped short, gripping the doorframe as if for support. God, no! There was a silence, heavy and thick. All eyes turned toward Peter, and in that silence suspicion began to curl like smoke. Later, as the body was lifted carefully onto a stretcher and borne up into the pale morning light, Miss Marple lingered in the cellar. She bent with difficulty, her thin fingers brushing the dusty steps. There on the stone was a mark, a scuff, not made by Harold's heavy shoes but by something lighter, smoother. And near the bottom of the steps, half hidden in the shadows, she spied a scrap of paper, torn and crumpled. She tucked it into her pocket without a word. When at last she emerged, the villagers were clustered in knots, whispering fiercely. Mrs. Withers, revived by smelling salts, was declaring with great authority that Peter had threatened his uncle only days before. Mr. Cobbler nodded grimly. I heard it myself, swore he'd never be ruled by Harold again. Lydia Redfern stood apart from the rest, her face white as chalk, her hands clasped tightly together. She neither wept nor spoke, but her eyes darted once, just once, toward Dr. Simons, who quickly looked away. Miss Marple observed it all with quiet attention. She did not speak, but her thoughts were already spinning a delicate web. An accident, perhaps. But she had seen too many accidents that were not accidents at all. That night, Elmsworth did not sleep easily. Windows glowed late with lamplight as villagers discussed the day's grim discovery. At the Trenchard house, Peter paced restlessly, while Lydia sat rigid in her chair, listening to the steady tick of the clock. At her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, examining the scrap of paper she had recovered. It was torn from a letter, written in a bold hand. Only a few words remained legible. You will regret this, Cellar. Miss Marple folded it neatly and slipped it into her knitting bag. She leaned back, her eyes half closed, and murmured, People say death comes quietly, but I have found it often comes with echoes. Echoes that linger if one only listens closely enough. And with that she banked the fire and went to bed, her mind already alive with possibilities. Chapter 6. The Obvious Suspect. The morning after Harold Trenchard's body was discovered, Elmsworth awoke to a new kind of stillness. Not the gentle peace of a country Sunday, but a taut, uneasy quiet, as though every cottage and hedge held its breath. News had flown faster than the milk cart. Harold dead in the church cellar, his neck broken. And though the doctor had muttered about accidents, the village had already chosen its story. By breakfast time, that story had a name. Peter, declared Mrs. Withers at the post office, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of certainty, quarreled with his uncle in broad daylight, stormed off in a rage, and now, well, here we are. Mark my words, the police won't need to look any further. Mrs. Price-Davies, though less robust in tone, nodded in agreement. It is very sad, but there it is. I dare say such tempers run in families. Still, I should never have thought him capable of violence. Cards and debts, yes, but murder. Mrs. Withers sniffed. Once a man raises his hand against his own flesh and blood, there's no telling where it ends. He had motive, he had temper, and he had opportunity. What more do they need? By mid-morning, a motor car rattled into the square bearing Inspector Graves from Marleycombe. He was a thick-set man with sandy hair and the air of one who had seen too much of human folly to be surprised by it. His sergeant, young and eager, trailed behind with a notebook at the ready. The villagers watched openly as Graves crossed the square, his boots striking firmly against the cobbles. They knew, as surely as if it had been posted on the church door, that his first call would be at the Trenchard house. And so it was. At the Trenchard dining room, Peter faced the inspector with a defiant lift of his chin. He had been pale since the discovery, his eyes shadowed, but his manner was all bravado. You can save your questions, Inspector, he said hotly. Yes, I quarreled with my uncle. Everyone knows it. He provoked me as he always did. But I left him alive and well. I had nothing to do with his death. Graves regarded him steadily. And where were you yesterday evening between 7 and 9? Peter hesitated only a moment. At Marleycombe. The King's Arms. I was playing billiards. The sergeant scribbled. Any witnesses? A dozen, Peter said quickly. Ask them. They'll tell you I was there. But Graves' eyes narrowed. And you left what time? Peter swallowed. Near 9:30. Perhaps later. I walked back. And the church cellar. Did you go near it? No. The word burst from him with such vehemence that Lydia, seated silently in the corner, flinched. Why should I? The inspector said nothing further, but the silence was heavy. At last he stood. "For now, Mr. Trenchard, I advise you not to leave the village. We may need a word with you again." When the policeman had gone, Lydia moved to Peter's side, laying a trembling hand on his arm. "You must not lose your temper so. It will only make things worse." Peter laughed harshly. "Temper is all they see in me. To them I'm already guilty. Well, let them think what they please." But though his words were bold, there was a flicker of fear in his eyes that did not escape Lydia, or the quiet observer who sat 2 cottages away, knitting steadily by her window. Miss Marple had seen Inspector Graves before, in another village matter, and she respected him as a competent man. But competence was not the same as wisdom. And wisdom, she thought, was often found in unexpected places, in a woman shelling peas, or in a gossip over tea, or in the tremor of a hand when a name was spoken. That afternoon she called at the vicarage under the pretext of returning a hymn book. The vicar, still pale from the discovery in his cellar, welcomed her with a weary smile. "A dreadful business, Miss Marple. Dreadful. Poor Harold, whatever his faults, he did much for the parish. And Peter. Oh dear, it looks so black for him." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her needles clicking softly. "Appearances can be deceptive, Reverend. One must not be too quick to judge. Young men are hot-headed, yes, but hot-headedness does not always end in murder." The vicar sighed. "Still, the quarrel, the debts, the opportunity. What can one think?" "One can think," said Miss Marple gently, "that in families quarrels often sound worse than they are. Many a nephew has threatened his uncle over money, but very few push them down cellars. It is useful to remember that." Later, as dusk fell, Inspector Graves made his report in the public house, where half the village contrived to overhear. "The young man's alibi is shaky," he told the landlord, his voice carrying. "He was seen at the King's Arms, yes, but left earlier than he claims. Between that time and the discovery, the murder could well have been committed. Unless more evidence appears, he is our chief suspect." Whispers buzzed around the room like bees in a hive. By the time the news reached Mrs. Withers's ears, it had grown into certainty. Peter Trenchard would soon be arrested. Miss Marple heard the same whispers, but her mind was elsewhere. That evening she spread out her knitting upon her lap, and from beneath it drew the scrap of paper she had found in the cellar. She smoothed it carefully. "You will regret this, Cellar." The words were stark, threatening. They did not sound like an accident, nor like a quarrel spoken in heat. They sounded deliberate. And Miss Marple, who had seen many such scraps in her time, thought to herself, "Too obvious, far too obvious." When suspicion is pointed so directly at one person, it is usually because someone wishes it to be so. She set the paper aside, her face thoughtful in the glow of the lamp. Outside, the village settled uneasily into sleep, while in one small cottage an elderly spinster pieced together the beginnings of a very different story. Chapter 7. Miss Marple Gathers Gossip. In every English village, there are 2 kinds of news: what is printed in the newspapers and what is passed over teacups. The former is public, proper, and dry. The latter is alive, woven with sighs, raised eyebrows, and knowing glances. It was this second kind of news that Miss Marple valued most, and it was this that she began to collect with the quiet patience of a gardener picking flowers one by one. The morning after Inspector Graves had paid his visit, Miss Marple was already on her way to Mrs. Withers's post office. She did not hurry, for she knew that gossip came more freely when one arrived as though by chance. Mrs. Withers, as expected, was bustling behind the counter, her sharp eyes darting from customer to customer. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Dreadful business, isn't it? Poor Mr. Trenchard, and poor Lydia. Though I dare say Peter brought this all upon himself." Miss Marple laid a parcel on the counter, her expression mild. "I only wish I understood how a strong man like Mr. Trenchard could fall in such a way. But perhaps you've heard something." That was all the encouragement Mrs. Withers needed. "They say Peter was drinking heavily at the King's Arms last night. Left in a temper, muttering about his uncle. Mr. Cobbler swears he saw him heading back towards the village just before the church bell struck 9. If that doesn't put him in the way of it, I don't know what does." Miss Marple merely inclined her head, murmuring something about young men being impulsive, but her mind stored away the detail neatly. From the post office she went on to call upon Mrs. Price-Davies, whose rheumatism had been more tolerable since the weather turned warm. The lady was seated by her window, her knitting limp in her lap. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began almost before her guest had sat down. "I cannot bear the thought of it. A murder in our own church cellar. Think of it. And Peter. Why, I always thought him wild, yes, but never cruel." Miss Marple offered her a scone and waited, knowing the silence would draw out more. Mrs. Price-Davies leaned forward, her voice low. "Of course, some think it was Lydia who suffered most at Harold's hands. He was not kind to her, Miss Marple. I have heard him scold her in the square as though she were a child. And she bore it, oh yes, but one never knows what lies beneath. You must admit she looked very pale of late." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "People who suffer often conceal it with smiles," she said. "It takes an observant eye to see the truth. And have you observed Dr. Simons in all this?" Mrs. Price-Davies started, then colored. "Why, only that he has called on Lydia more than once these past weeks. But of course, she has had her nerves to manage. Perfectly proper." Miss Marple nodded gently, her eyes as mild as blue sky. By afternoon, Miss Marple had taken tea with the vicar's wife, who had her own morsels to offer. "Reverend Pritchard is much distressed naturally," Mrs. Pritchard said, pressing shortbread upon her guest. "He blames himself for leaving the cellar unlocked. But I cannot help wondering, why was Mr. Trenchard in the church at that hour at all? He was not a man much given to piety." Miss Marple agreed softly. "Yes, that is curious indeed. And who else might have had business there?" Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, then whispered, "Well, you know how he quarreled not only with Peter but also with the council. He made enemies, Miss Marple. Strong ones. Why, only last month Mr. Cobbler vowed he'd not set foot in church again while Harold ruled the purse strings." Miss Marple accepted another shortbread, her expression serene. "Ah, it is often so, when one man's hand is too heavy on the reins." By evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her neat parlor, her day's gleanings spread before her, not on paper, but in the quiet order of her mind. Each word, each look, each whispered complaint had been gathered and sorted like so many skeins of wool. From Mrs. Withers, Peter in the square, drunk and muttering. From Mrs. Price-Davies, Lydia's quiet suffering, and Dr. Simons's attentions. From Mrs. Pritchard, the question of why Harold went into the cellar at all. It made a picture, not yet complete, but with the outlines clear. Harold had quarreled with many, not only Peter. Lydia's smiles hid something sharper. Dr. Simons was more than a physician. And Harold's presence in the cellar was not explained by accident. Miss Marple leaned back, the faintest smile touching her lips. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of quarrels there that had led to tragic ends, of women whose nervous hands revealed what their lips would never say. People were much the same everywhere, she reflected. Human nature did not change with the name of a village. She folded her knitting and extinguished the lamp. Outside, the night lay soft over Elmsworth, but in her quiet mind the threads of the puzzle glimmered, waiting to be drawn together. And Miss Marple, who seemed to all the world a simple old lady, was already listening for the faintest echo, the kind that might lead her to the truth. Chapter 8. Lydia and the Doctor. Lydia Redfern had always been admired in Elmsworth. Not for her beauty, though she was handsome in her way, but for her composure. She had the gift of seeming unruffled even when the world about her was in chaos. At church socials she was calm, at the summer fete she had arranged flowers with a steady hand, and even when her husband's temper had risen, she had smiled with an air of patient endurance. But now, with Harold dead and whispers swirling through the village, her composure looked like something else entirely, like fear dressed in silk. Miss Marple made her way to the Redfern house on a bright morning when the air smelled faintly of cut grass. She carried with her a small jar of strawberry preserve, a little excuse for calling. Lydia herself opened the door, her figure neat in a gray dress, though the dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed restless nights. "Miss Marple," she said warmly enough. "How kind. Do come in." The drawing-room was in perfect order, though a faint scent of lavender polish could not disguise the heaviness of a house that had seen arguments echo in its rooms. Lydia poured tea with mechanical precision, her hands steady but her gaze wandering. Miss Marple admired the roses on the mantelpiece. "Such beautiful blooms, my dear. You must have cut them yourself. How soothing it is to busy one's hands in the garden, especially at times when the mind is troubled." Lydia's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, one must keep occupied. They spoke of trivialities at first, but Miss Marple, with the skill of long practice, let her words drift toward Harold. "He was a man of strong opinions," Miss Marple said gently. "And strong men often find themselves opposed, don't they?" Lydia's cup clinked against its saucer. Harold was firm in his ways. It made him respected, though not always loved. "And you bore it bravely," Miss Marple said with sympathy. For a moment, Lydia looked as if she would speak more freely, but just then the sound of the gate latch broke the silence. Both women glanced up. A tall figure in a tweed jacket strode toward the house. Dr. Simons entered without knocking, as though accustomed to it. His dark hair was flecked with gray, his manner brisk but with a certain protectiveness that did not escape Miss Marple's eye. "Lydia," he said quickly, "you should be resting. Too many callers will exhaust you." Then he noticed Miss Marple, and his expression shifted into polite courtesy. "Ah, good morning, Miss Marple. Forgive me. I thought Lydia might be alone." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, Doctor. I was just leaving, but it is always a pleasure to see how attentive you are to your patients." Dr. Simons cleared his throat. "It is my duty. Mrs. Redfern has been under considerable strain." Lydia's color rose faintly. "I am well, truly. You mustn't fuss." Miss Marple's eyes, seemingly fixed on her knitting bag, did not miss the fleeting look exchanged between them. Affection tinged with something heavier, perhaps guilt, perhaps secrecy. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Withers outside the post office. Naturally, she had her own observations. "Mark my words," Mrs. Withers declared. "The doctor spends too much time with Lydia. It isn't only medicine he offers, if you take my meaning. Why, he was seen walking her home from the church meeting last fortnight, Harold storming behind them like thunderclouds. There's your motive if ever one needed one." Miss Marple nodded mildly, though inwardly she weighed the words. A jealous husband, a wife too close to another man. Yes, such things had ended in violence before. Yet Harold was dead, not Lydia, and the echo in the cellar still whispered of something more complicated. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her little parlor, a fire crackling softly though the air was still mild. She set aside her knitting and reflected. If Dr. Simons and Lydia were bound by more than doctor and patient, Harold would surely have known. A man as prideful as Harold would not have suffered humiliation quietly. Had he confronted them? And if so, had Lydia, or the doctor, struck back? Miss Marple thought of Lydia's pale face, her trembling hands hidden behind well-bred composure. Of Dr. Simons, whose protective manner spoke volumes. And she thought of Harold, strong but unyielding, his body now broken in the church cellar. Human nature, Miss Marple reminded herself, was the same in Elmsworth as in St. Mary Mead. Men grew jealous. Women grew desperate. And sometimes, behind polite curtains, the truth was darker than the gossip that fluttered outside. She rose, stirred the fire, and murmured softly, "It will not do to decide too soon. Appearances, after all, can deceive." But in her heart, Miss Marple knew she had seen the shadow of something binding Lydia and Dr. Simons together, a shadow that might well stretch into the cellar where Harold had met his end. Chapter 9. The Vicar's Nervous Silence. Asterisk from Miss Marple and the echo from the cellar. The Reverend Pritchard was a man who looked older than his years, his thin frame stooped, his eyes magnified by round spectacles that always seemed a little smudged. To the villagers of Elmsworth, he was earnest, kindly, and given to long, wandering sermons. But since the night of Harold Trenchard's death, he had appeared more distracted than usual. Miss Marple noticed it first on Sunday morning. The service was solemn enough, but the vicar stumbled over the liturgy, repeated phrases unnecessarily, and at one point dropped his prayer book with a nervous jerk. Lydia Redfern, pale and elegant in black, kept her eyes fixed on the floor. Dr. Simons sat stiffly beside her. Peter, sullen and weary, stood apart. But it was the vicar's hands that interested Miss Marple most. They shook when he turned the pages. They clenched when he spoke the words, "Forgive us our trespasses." And when the hymn ended, he hurried from the pulpit with an air of relief that did not escape her watchful gaze. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Pritchard received her warmly, ushering her into the parlor where the tea-table was already laid with sponge cake and currant buns. "Such a dreadful trial for my husband," Mrs. Pritchard said, pouring out tea. "He blames himself, you see. If only the cellar door had been locked properly, if only he had checked it himself, Harold Trenchard might still be alive." Miss Marple accepted her cup with her usual mild smile. "Your husband is conscientious, my dear. But surely he cannot be held accountable for every latch and key." Mrs. Pritchard sighed. "He thinks otherwise. He was meant to secure the cellar after choir practice that evening. He says he forgot. And now, well, now he fears that his negligence was the cause of tragedy." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though in her heart she doubted it was mere negligence that troubled the vicar. She had her opportunity to test this when Reverend Pritchard himself entered the room. He looked tired, his collar askew, his eyes wary. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting a smile. "A kind visit, though I fear I am poor company these days." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "I wanted only to reassure you that no one blames you for what occurred in the cellar. These things, alas, have a way of happening regardless of our precautions." The vicar's hand trembled as he lifted his cup. "You are charitable, Miss Marple. But I cannot help thinking I might have prevented it. Harold was a difficult man, but his death weighs heavily." Miss Marple allowed a pause, then asked gently, "You had reason to be in the cellar that evening, I think? Did you not?" The vicar's eyes flickered, and his spoon clattered against the saucer. Why do you say that?" "Oh, merely that one of the choir boys thought he saw you near the vestry door after practice," Miss Marple said lightly, as though it were of no consequence. For a long moment, silence hung in the air. The vicar's face turned pale. Then, with a forced laugh, he said, "I may have gone back to fetch a book. Yes, that was all. A book I had left." Miss Marple did not press further. She merely murmured something about forgetfulness and let the conversation drift to parish matters. But in her mind, she weighed his reaction. A man who merely forgot a book did not tremble so, nor did his wife speak of guilt so constantly. Later, as Miss Marple walked home beneath the fading light, she reviewed the facts. The cellar door had been unlocked. The vicar admitted, however reluctantly, to being near it that evening. Harold Trenchard had ended his life at the bottom of that same cellar. Coincidence, perhaps. But Miss Marple did not believe much in coincidence. She thought, too, of other vicars she had known. Good men, but human, subject to fear, to weakness, and sometimes to silence when silence seemed safer than truth. The echo from the cellar was not only of Harold's quarrelsome voice. It was also the echo of footsteps, hasty and secretive, belonging to someone who wished not to be seen. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, the evening shadows lengthening across her roses. "Yes," she murmured softly. "The vicar knows more than he dares to tell. And fear, my dear Jane, is often the loudest silence of all." Chapter 10. Old Wounds. In every village there are histories not written down but carried in the hearts of its people. Quarrels, disappointments, betrayals. None are ever truly forgotten. They linger, like bruises beneath the skin, surfacing at the most unexpected times. In Elmsworth, Harold Trenchard had been the sort of man who made enemies, and now that he was dead, the old wounds he had inflicted seemed to reopen with startling speed. Miss Marple, knitting bag in hand, walked toward the King's Arms that afternoon. She had no fondness for beer or for taverns, but she knew from long experience that public houses were repositories of valuable information. Men, loosened by ale, were often less guarded than women at their tea tables. The landlord, Mr. Cobbler, greeted her with a broad grin. "Miss Marple, a rare honor. You'll not be after a pint, eh?" "Only a ginger beer, if you please," she replied mildly, settling herself in a corner where she could observe without seeming to. It took little time for the conversation among the locals to turn toward Harold Trenchard. "Good riddance, I say," muttered old Mr. Squires, slamming his glass down. "He cheated me out of land years ago, swore it was his by boundary, when everyone knew otherwise. Took it straight to court, he did, and left me with nothing but costs. And now look. Justice at last." "Justice?" barked Mr. Cobbler, coming round with Miss Marple's ginger beer. "You call it justice when a man's found broken in a church cellar? A sin, more like. But don't think I'll mourn him, mind you. He wanted to raise the parish rates, and when I spoke against it, he called me a miser to my face. A miser, I ask you, after all I've done for this village." Laughter greeted this outburst, but beneath it Miss Marple heard bitterness. These were not passing quarrels, they were wounds, carried for years. Later that week, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Price-Davies again. The elderly woman, eager for company, welcomed her into a sitting room full of family portraits. "My late husband never forgave Harold," she confided. "They were partners in a shipping venture once, long ago. Harold withdrew at the last moment, left my husband to bear the loss alone. Oh, how bitterly he spoke of it on his deathbed. And I confess I never forgot. Harold prospered while we pinched and scraped." Her eyes gleamed, bright with old resentment. "If I were younger and stronger, Miss Marple, I might almost have struck him myself." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "We none of us know what we are capable of, when pride and loss are touched." It was in the grocer's shop that she gathered another thread. Young Elsie, who had worked as a maid in Harold's household, lowered her voice as she served Miss Marple sugar. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but I'll tell you something. Mr. Trenchard, he wasn't kind to Mrs. Redfern. Oh, he had a sharp tongue. I saw her cry more than once, when she thought no one was looking. And he kept her on short allowance, too. A lady like her counting pennies for butter." Miss Marple nodded, eyes thoughtful. That wound, perhaps, was the deepest of all. The wound of a marriage lived in fear and constraint. By evening, Miss Marple sat in her quiet parlor, arranging her thoughts. Mr. Squires, cheated in land. Mr. Cobbler, humiliated in public. Mrs. Price-Davies, left impoverished by Harold's betrayal. Lydia Redfern, bound in an unhappy marriage. Each grievance was sharp, each wound real. And yet, not every wound turned to murder. Miss Marple, with her long memory of human folly, reflected that it was often not the longest-standing grievance that flared into violence, but the most immediate. Still, she mused, Harold's death had loosened tongues that might otherwise have remained closed. People who once feared him now spoke freely, and in their bitterness, they revealed more than they knew. She rose, drew the curtains, and set her knitting aside. The night was quiet, the village lay still. But in the echoing silence of the cellar, she imagined those old wounds reverberating, mingling with the sound of Harold's last quarrel. "Old quarrels seldom die," she murmured softly. "They wait. And sometimes they wait for blood." Chapter 11. The Vanished Letter. The business of Harold Trenchard's estate had begun sooner than propriety dictated, though not sooner than curiosity demanded. Death in a small village was always followed by a swift sorting of papers, wills, and whispered expectations. It was said Harold left his affairs in strict order. Yet as often happens when order is proclaimed too loudly, disorder appeared at once. On a damp Monday morning, Mr. Evans, the solicitor from Marleycombe, arrived at the Redfern house to examine Harold's papers. Lydia, composed but pale, received him in the study. Miss Marple, visiting with the smallest of excuses, a basket of scones, was invited to sit in the drawing-room while business was conducted. Her ears, however, remained keenly attentive. The voices carried faintly through the half-closed door. "Everything should be here," Lydia said quietly. "Harold kept his documents in this cabinet." A pause, the sound of keys, the scrape of a drawer. Then Mr. Evans's voice, perplexed. "Curious. Very curious indeed. Mrs. Redfern, you are certain nothing has been disturbed?" "Nothing at all. I have not touched his papers since that night." Miss Marple heard the rustle of folders, the creak of leather. "There is a will, of course," Mr. Evans said at last. "But I am looking for another paper, a letter from Harold to me dated last month, concerning a change in his intentions. It was explicit, and he instructed me to keep a duplicate here until the new will could be drawn. Yet it is gone." "Gone?" Lydia's voice faltered. "Yes. Removed." The silence that followed was louder than any words. Later, when Mr. Evans had departed with his briefcase and his frown, Miss Marple found herself walking with Lydia in the garden. The roses were heavy with rain, their fragrance clinging to the air. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must not distress yourself unduly. Papers have a way of slipping from their places." Lydia pressed her hands together. "You do not understand, Miss Marple. Harold was most particular. Nothing left his study without his knowledge. If a letter has vanished, it was taken." Miss Marple's eyes rested kindly on her. "Perhaps by Harold himself?" Lydia shook her head. "No. He was proud of that letter. It would have altered his will. Oh, I should not speak of it, but he meant to cut Peter off almost entirely, and to make other provisions." Her voice dropped. "If Peter knew, if anyone knew, it would give motive enough, wouldn't it?" That evening, over tea with Mrs. Withers at the post office, Miss Marple learned more. "Mark my words," Mrs. Withers declared. "Peter heard about that letter. Why, he was in the King's Arms boasting not a fortnight ago that the old man had no power over him. Said he'd be master soon enough. And now, well, now the letter's missing and Harold's in his grave. Draw your own conclusions." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Boastful words are often just that, my dear. But it is interesting that the letter should vanish at such a time." The matter grew still more curious the next day, when Miss Marple encountered Dr. Simons near the vicarage. He looked tired, his manner brusque. "You'll have heard about that letter," he said abruptly. "The whole village is talking of it. If you ask me, it's nonsense. Lawyers misplace things all the time." Miss Marple looked at him mildly. "Perhaps." Yet Lydia seemed quite certain it had been kept safely in the study. The doctor frowned. "Then someone has meddled. But why? Unless—" He broke off, biting his lip. "Unless," prompted Miss Marple softly. He shook his head. "No matter. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, Harold's affairs were tangled. He owed money more than most realized. If that letter changed his will, someone stood to lose heavily." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. That night, alone in her cottage, she pieced together the day's fragments. Harold had written a letter to his solicitor, intending to alter his will. That letter, left in his study, had now vanished. Its disappearance benefited someone. Perhaps Peter, perhaps another. Harold died before the new will could be made. Miss Marple reflected that wills and letters were often at the heart of village tragedies. Greed was as old as human nature, and desperation often more dangerous than hatred. She leaned back in her chair, the firelight flickering on her calm face. Somewhere in Elmsworth was a person who knew exactly where that letter had gone. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that same person knew why Harold Trenchard had ended his life in the cellar. For echoes were not only sounds carried by stone walls. They were also the reverberations of secrets. Secrets like a vanished letter, whose absence spoke louder than its words ever could. Chapter 12. The Doctor's Shaky Alibi. The talk in Elmsworth now circled less around Harold Trenchard's death itself than around the missing letter. In the bakery, in the grocer's, at the bus stop, whispers passed from ear to ear. Someone had taken it. That much was certain. But who? And why? Dr. Simons, once regarded as a pillar of calm in village life, found himself the unwilling subject of those whispers. For though no one spoke openly against him, it was remembered how quickly he had arrived at the Redfern house on the night of Harold's death. Too quickly, some thought. And when questions were asked, his answers grew less precise than one might expect from a man trained to recall details. It was Mrs. Price, the vicar's housekeeper, who first raised the matter with Miss Marple as they walked together through the churchyard. "Funny thing, isn't it?" Mrs. Price said, her voice low, though no one was near. "The doctor says he was called to Mrs. Doran's cottage that evening. but she swears blind she never sent for him till much later. And what's more, she remembers he seemed out of breath when he arrived, as though he'd been hurrying from somewhere else entirely. Miss Marple, pausing to straighten a wreath on a grave, replied gently, "Memory, dear Mrs. Price, is a curious thing. People remember best what fits their sense of drama. Still, a doctor's timings should be accurate, ought they not?" That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the surgery, ostensibly to collect some tonic recommended for her rheumatism. Dr. Simons, tall and grave, received her with his usual courtesy, though a faint impatience flickered in his eyes. "You've been busy, doctor," she remarked as she accepted the small bottle. "Too busy, Miss Marple. The strain of this affair is telling on everyone. I've half a mind to close my practice for a week and go to the sea." "Ah, but then," Miss Marple said mildly, "some might ask what you were doing the night poor Mr. Trenchard died. They say you were called to Mrs. Doran later than you admit." The doctor stiffened. "Idle gossip. I was sent for at 9 o'clock, as I've said. I reached her cottage within 20 minutes. She was coughing badly, and I gave her a draught. That is all." "Strange," Miss Marple observed, tilting her head, "for Mrs. Doran insists it was nearer 10 before you arrived." His eyes flashed. "The old woman is mistaken." "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Yet I cannot help thinking you looked unsettled that night, as though you had run quite a distance." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Dr. Simons gave a short laugh. "You are shrewd, Miss Marple. Perhaps I did hurry, but only because I had stopped at the Redfern house first. Lydia was in great distress. She telephoned me after Harold's collapse, and I went at once. Surely that is natural enough." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked faintly in her bag. "Most natural, yes. Only the telephone lines were reported out of order that evening." His face blanched, then colored. "Then perhaps I misremember. These things, these details, they blur." The following morning, Constable Jenkins called on Miss Marple at her cottage. He looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot as he accepted a slice of seed cake. "Truth is, ma'am, the inspector's not satisfied with the doctor's statement. The times don't add up. If he was at the Redfern house when Harold died, why didn't he say so straight away? And if he wasn't, where was he? That's what we want to know." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Doctors, Constable, are men of science. Yet they are also men, with pride, fears, and secrets. If Dr. Simons is concealing something, it may not be murder, but it is something important all the same." Later that week, at the vicarage tea, the matter resurfaced. Reverend Colby, ever gentle, ventured, "I fear the doctor is under suspicion, and yet he has been our friend for years. One hates to believe." Miss Marple interrupted softly, "Suspicion is like smoke, vicar. It may mean a fire, or only a candle blown out of place. But one must watch carefully to know which." Mrs. Withers, bustling in with the cake stand, added her piece. "Well, I don't like it. He's hiding something, mark my words. My cousin saw him walking back from the direction of the Redfern house that night, alone and very pale. Why, if he had nothing to fear?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant. Why indeed? The truth was, Miss Marple had already formed a theory. The missing letter, the confused timings, the doctor's nervousness, they were not random. They pointed to a hidden connection. But she did not share her thoughts just yet. She had learned long ago that human beings, left to their own devices, often revealed far more than they intended. And Dr. Simons, with his shaky alibi, would in time betray himself, if only one listened carefully enough to the echoes of the cellar. Chapter 13. A Whisper in the Cellar. The cellar beneath St. Luke's had grown quiet again, as though the stones themselves had decided to withhold their secrets. Yet Miss Marple knew well enough that silence often spoke more loudly than words. It was not merely a place of storage and shadow. It was, she felt, a stage on which the final act of Harold Trenchard's life had been played. And like all stages, it still held the faint reverberation of what had occurred there. Inspector Graves returned to Elmsworth that morning, looking weary. He summoned Constable Jenkins and, to Miss Marple's surprise, invited her to accompany them to the church. "Not procedure, I grant you," he muttered as they walked. "But you've an eye for things others miss, Miss Marple. I'll not deny it." She inclined her head. "I shall merely sit in a corner, Inspector, and let you gentlemen do the searching. But I find sometimes, if one is very quiet, places do whisper their stories." The cellar smelled of damp earth and candle grease. Wooden crates and half-empty wine racks lined the walls. In the corner, a stack of hymnals leaned precariously, dust coating their spines. Constable Jenkins struck a match and lit the lantern. The yellow glow spread across the stone floor, where chalk marks still outlined the place Harold's body had lain. "Nothing here," Jenkins said, sounding unconvinced even as he spoke. But Miss Marple, lowering herself onto an old pew bench, merely folded her hands. She watched and listened. It was then that the wind stirred through the narrow grating above, carrying with it a faint sound, so faint that the men did not notice. A scrap of paper fluttered behind the wine racks. "Dear me," Miss Marple said softly. "Might we move those bottles, Constable?" Grumbling, Jenkins obeyed. Behind the rack lay a torn fragment of letterhead, damp at the edges. Inspector Graves crouched, reading aloud. "Not be silent any longer. If you do not confess, the truth will come out. Yours." The signature was missing. Graves whistled. Blackmail, by heaven. And who was pressing Trenchard, I wonder? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Or perhaps it was Trenchard himself, writing to another. The cellar is not where one expects to find a gentleman's private correspondence, unless it was dropped in haste, or snatched away and discarded. As they pondered, Jenkins ran his hand along the wall and frowned. "Sir, feel here. The mortar's loose." Indeed, a stone shifted slightly under his pressure. Graves pulled it free. Behind lay a shallow cavity, dark and cold. Inside was nothing but a shred of wax seal, red and broken. Miss Marple peered at it closely. This was no ordinary seal. I fancy it belonged to something official. Perhaps a solicitor's letter or a will. Graves pocketed it grimly. If Trenchard was altering his will or threatening to expose someone, that gives us half the village with motive. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was already racing. That evening at the vicarage, she shared tea with Reverend Colby. The discovery weighed on her thoughts. Harold Trenchard had a habit, she murmured, of pressing where it hurt most. Money, pride, secrets. He never could leave them be. If he had threatened exposure, someone might well have felt desperate enough to silence him. And the cellar, dear vicar, may hold not just echoes of his death, but of the truths he intended to speak. The Reverend looked troubled. "It chills me, Miss Marple, to think of the house of God used for such purposes." "Ah," she said softly, "but human frailty does not spare sacred walls. One must not expect it to." That night, lying in bed, Miss Marple recalled the faint flutter of the paper, the whisper of the wind through the grating. To others it might have seemed chance, but she knew better. The cellar had whispered, and she had listened. And somewhere in that whisper lay the beginning of the truth. Chapter 14. The Second Confession. Confessions, Miss Marple reflected, were like weeds in a garden. The moment one sprang up, another was bound to follow, for guilt, whether large or small, seldom thrived in isolation. Harold Trenchard's death had already loosened tongues, but now, with the discovery of the torn letter and the seal in the cellar, the village seemed ready to spill more secrets. It was Mrs. Redfern who came to see Miss Marple first. The young widow arrived at the cottage one damp morning, her face pale, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. "I must tell someone," she whispered as Miss Marple led her to a chair. "It's about Harold. About something I never said before." Miss Marple, pouring tea, merely nodded. She had learned that silence was often more encouraging than questions. Lydia's voice shook. "That night before he went out, Harold and I argued. He accused me, oh, I hardly know how to say it, of being unfaithful. He said he had proof. A letter, he claimed, from someone I cared for. I swore it wasn't true, but he only laughed. And then he left the house, saying he would show the letter to the whole village if I dared deny him again." Her eyes brimmed with tears. Miss Marple, I never betrayed my marriage, however cruel he was. But if Harold truly had such a letter, it could only have been forged or stolen. And now it is missing." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "My dear, men such as your husband sometimes mistake their own bitterness for evidence. Whether the letter existed or not, the important thing is, it gave him a weapon. And someone may have killed him to silence that weapon." The very next day, another confession arrived, this time from an entirely different quarter. Mr. Cobbler, the landlord of the King's Arms, sought Miss Marple out as she left the church. His ruddy face was uncharacteristically sober. "I'll tell you plain, ma'am," he said, lowering his voice. "I've been keeping something back. That night, after closing, I saw Dr. Simons near the churchyard. He looked agitated, pacing back and forth. When he spotted me, he muttered something about a late call and hurried off. I thought it none of my business at the time, but with all this talk of alibis and letters, I'd best speak." Miss Marple regarded him with mild surprise. "It is curious, Mr. Cobbler, how often the truth hides in small corners, waiting for its moment to come out. I dare say you've done wisely." That evening, Inspector Graves called at the cottage. His expression was grim. "We've had 2 more statements, Miss Marple. Mrs. Redfern claims Harold threatened her with a letter, and Cobbler swears he saw the doctor wandering the churchyard at the very hour Trenchard must have died. If both are true, it changes everything." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "Indeed, Inspector. One confession explains motive, the other undermines an alibi. Together they paint a picture." Graves sighed. "But is it the right picture? That's the devil of it. Every time we think we see the truth, the canvas shifts." "Human beings, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "are rather like tapestries. From the back, all you see are knots and tangles. Only from the front do you glimpse the design. Our task is to turn it round." Later that night, as she sat alone, Miss Marple considered both confessions. Lydia's fear, Cobbler's sighting. They did not contradict, they interwove. If Harold had indeed possessed a letter that threatened Lydia's reputation, then someone else, perhaps the very person implicated in it, might have panicked. And if Dr. Simons had been seen near the churchyard, then his presence in the cellar could no longer be dismissed as gossip. Yet something still felt wrong. The missing letter, the broken seal, the cellar's whisper, they all spoke of a plan carefully laid. Murder born not of sudden rage, but of long calculation. And Miss Marple knew well, a second confession seldom ended a story. It only deepened the mystery. Chapter 15. The Broken Alibi. The village of Elmsworth was a quiet place, yet that very quietness could conceal more than loud cities ever did. Secrets hid in corners, whispered in shadows, and waited for the right moment to surface. For Dr. Simons, that moment was fast approaching. Inspector Graves had called him to the Redfern house that morning. Dr. Simons, tall and composed, entered the room with his usual measured steps, but even he could not entirely hide the faint tension in his shoulders. "Doctor," Graves began, "you have already given your statement about your whereabouts on the night of Harold Trenchard's death. We have new evidence, and I need full clarity." Dr. Simons nodded, his lips pressed tightly together. "I understand, Inspector. I have already told everything I know." Graves did not answer immediately. He laid a small pile of papers on the table. "2 witnesses now place you near the churchyard at the time in question. Mr. Cobbler saw you pacing, and Miss Marple herself notes inconsistencies in your timeline. How do you explain this?" The doctor's eyes flickered, betraying a brief moment of alarm. He cleared his throat. I had been visiting Mrs. Doran. She was unwell, and I hurried from her cottage toward the Redfern house. I may have paused near the churchyard to collect my thoughts. That is all." Inspector Graves raised an eyebrow. "And yet, Constable Jenkins reports you arrived at Mrs. Doran's later than you stated. There seems to be a discrepancy, Doctor." Dr. Simons hesitated, then smiled thinly. "Time can be misleading, Inspector. I assure you I was there promptly." Miss Marple, sitting quietly to one side, observed him with her calm, piercing gaze. She had known all along that his alibi was shaky, but she allowed him to stumble through the inconsistencies before speaking. "Doctor," she said softly, "one does not need to lie outright to mislead. Omissions are often more telling than words." Dr. Simons turned toward her. "Miss Marple, I only remark that you seemed hurried, anxious, perhaps more than a mere visit to a patient would require. I wonder what might have caused such agitation." He glanced at Inspector Graves, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Dr. Simons's composure wavered. "Very well," Dr. Simons said finally, his voice tight. "I admit I was near the churchyard. But I did not go into the cellar. I swear it. I only walked past, returning from Mrs. Doran, and I saw something. I saw Harold arguing with someone. I left before it happened." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, so you saw him alive, but then left him for who, exactly?" "I do not know," he admitted, his hands tightening on the table. "I do not know who he was arguing with. By the time I returned, Harold was gone. I swear I had no part in his death." Inspector Graves leaned back, considering the confession. "That is quite an admission, Doctor. It clears you of direct involvement. But only just. It also means someone else was in the cellar with him. Did you notice anything else? Anyone familiar, perhaps?" Dr. Simons shook his head. "I cannot say. A shadow, a voice. It all happened so quickly. I only know I left because I feared being accused." Miss Marple rose slowly. "And yet, Doctor, the missing letter, the torn seal, and the whispers from the cellar. They all speak of someone acting with forethought. It is not enough to claim absence. Timing, Doctor, is everything. And someone's absence may be more telling than presence." Dr. Simons swallowed, his hands fidgeting. For the first time, he seemed genuinely anxious. Graves, too, was alert, sensing the shift in the room. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "you always observe things others miss. Are you implying that you were aware of the letter's existence?" Miss Marple finished calmly. "Or perhaps feared someone might use it against you. People often act to protect themselves or those they care for." The doctor's shoulders slumped. "Ah, yes. I knew of the letter. I feared its contents could ruin Lydia, and by extension, put me in a difficult position. I followed Harold, not to harm him but to intercept him. I did not intend death, I swear." Inspector Graves regarded him steadily. "Doctor, that is a significant admission. Your actions, while not murder, show you were present at a critical moment. That much cannot be ignored." Miss Marple, returning to her chair, considered the implications. Dr. Simons had broken his alibi, though not entirely his innocence. He had been present near the scene, aware of a secret letter, motivated by concern for Lydia. But someone else, she suspected, had used the opportunity to act decisively. "The cellar," she murmured, "does not lie. And the letter, it is central. Once its path is known, the rest will follow." The doctor nodded silently. "I fear I am more entangled than I imagined." "And so, Doctor," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but firm, "we shall observe closely. Timing, motives, and secrets. Those are the threads we must follow to unravel the truth." Chapter 16. The Hidden Witness. Elmsworth had grown quieter in the wake of Dr. Simons' broken alibi. Gossip still simmered, but now the villagers whispered with caution, aware that the investigation had entered a more serious phase. Still, some secrets, Miss Marple knew, were hidden not in walls or documents, but in the eyes of those who watched in silence. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage after a morning walk when there was a hesitant knock at the door. She opened it to find young Elsie, the maid who had worked for the Redferns. The girl's eyes were wide, her hands twisting a handkerchief nervously. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I think I saw something that night. I wasn't supposed to be out, but I went to the kitchen window. I didn't mean to, but I saw." Miss Marple gently guided her inside and seated her with a cup of tea. "Take your time, my dear. Start at the beginning." Elsie's voice trembled. "I saw I saw someone in the cellar. I didn't recognize him at first. The light. It was just a candle, and he moved quickly. But I did hear him speak to Harold. It was angry. Very angry. And then I saw the flash of paper in his hand. He dropped it. And Harold. Oh, Miss Marple, Harold. He fell. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. A flash of paper, you say? And did you recognize the man? Elsie shook her head. No, his face was mostly in shadow. But I saw the coat. Dark, like Dr. Simon's wears sometimes, though. I'm not certain. I was too frightened to look properly. Miss Marple's mind raced. A witness, previously unseen, who had observed part of the crime, or at least the confrontation. Though Elsie could not positively identify the man, the detail of the paper suggested the missing letter. Thank you, Elsie. You have been very brave, Miss Marple said kindly. One must not be afraid to speak the truth, even if it frightens one. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, the girl whispered, relief flooding her features. Later, Miss Marple shared the account with Inspector Graves. A hidden witness, she explained, young and frightened but present at a crucial moment. She saw a figure in the cellar holding a piece of paper. Dropped in haste. That is likely the missing letter, or part of it. It also suggests the murderer may have been interrupted or hurried. Graves nodded, frowning. It corroborates what we suspected about the letter, but it doesn't identify who acted. Could it have been Dr. Simon's, or someone else? That remains to be determined, Miss Marple replied softly. Yet the presence of a witness changes the dynamics. We now know Harold confronted someone holding a letter. That someone panicked, or acted deliberately. And young Elsie's observation tells us they were near the cellar steps at the critical moment. The following evening, Miss Marple revisited the Redfern house to speak with Lydia. The widow sat by the fire, her expression tense but grateful for Miss Marple's presence. I had not the courage to tell anyone, Lydia admitted, her voice low. I feared what might be revealed. I thought Harold's death might silence everything. Miss Marple placed her hand on Lydia's. The truth has a way of coming out, my dear. And sometimes, seeing someone else's fear or courage helps untangle the knots we cannot solve alone. Lydia looked at her, hope mingling with sorrow. You think we will know? Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. The witness gives us a thread. We must follow it carefully, but it is a thread that leads to the truth. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, piecing together the events. The missing letter had been in the hands of someone in the cellar. Elsie had seen a figure, dark-coated, angry, holding paper. Dr. Simon's broken alibi suggested he was nearby, but Elsie could not positively identify him. Motive, timing, and panic intertwined. The puzzle was complex, but for the first time, Miss Marple sensed the shape of the design. A confrontation over the letter had taken place. The wrong person had acted in haste, and Harold's death was the tragic result. The hidden witness, she murmured, has lifted the veil. Now we shall see who stepped into the cellar and why. Chapter 17. Clues in the Shadows. The cellar was colder than usual that morning, the damp stones exhaling a chill that seemed to reach into one's very thoughts. Miss Marple and Inspector Graves returned, determined to examine the place with new eyes, guided by Elsie's testimony. Observe closely, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder. Shadows conceal more than they reveal. One must move deliberately and listen and imagine as one walks. Graves, flashlight in hand, nodded. I've never known you to miss anything, Miss Marple. Lead the way. Miss Marple's gaze swept the cellar from wall to wall. The wine racks, the crates of old parish supplies, the uneven stone floor, everything was noted, catalogued in her mind. Then her eyes rested on the corner where the first scrap of paper had been found. Here, she said softly, kneeling to examine the floor. See the faint scuff marks in the dust? Someone dropped a paper, hurriedly stepped back, and brushed against the wall. Footprints, small, narrow, not heavy like Dr. Simon's, but not a child's either. Likely someone of average build, moving quickly, deliberately. Graves crouched beside her. That matches Elsie's account of the figure and the letter. But why leave it here? If they intended to hide it, they wouldn't have been so careless. Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. Panic, Inspector. Hasty decisions. Fear often outweighs logic. Her eyes then shifted to a loose stone near the back wall, the same cavity where the wax seal had been discovered. She pressed gently. It gave slightly. Ah, she murmured. Someone returned here after dropping the letter. Perhaps to recover it, or to inspect the scene. They did not find the letter, but they left behind the seal. A signature mark of anxiety, if ever there was one. Graves shone his flashlight in the cavity. It's empty. The letter is gone. Whoever this was, they were thorough enough to take the key item. Miss Marple's gaze traveled along the floorboards. Faint scratches ran from the steps toward the corner, then curved toward the old wine racks. Kneeling again, she noted a dark stain, barely visible. Blood, she said quietly. Not much. Likely from a cut, perhaps a scraped hand or a minor injury during the struggle. But it confirms a confrontation. Harold was alive, yes, but not unresisting. Graves looked impressed. You can deduce all that from a smear of red? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Observation is a patient art, Inspector. One must see what others think invisible, and hear what others believe silent. She then examined the wine racks more closely. One bottle had been slightly displaced. When she pulled it forward, a folded scrap of paper tumbled down. Graves caught it mid-air. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, the edges torn in haste. I cannot allow you to expose me. If the letter goes, all is lost. You must listen, or the consequences will be dire. Miss Marple read it aloud. It is a warning, Inspector. And note, the handwriting is not Harold's. Someone else was aware of the letter and was desperate to prevent its revelation. Graves' eyes narrowed. That narrows the suspects considerably. Someone who knew about the letter, someone with motive, and someone present at the cellar. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And the shadows of the cellar have shown us traces. Footprints, scuff marks, a blood smear, a hastily discarded warning. Together, these clues indicate fear, haste, and guilt. But the identity, that must be inferred from knowledge of human nature. Later, as they left the cellar, Miss Marple paused at the threshold. She turned, observing the shadows stretching along the stone walls. The hidden witness, the footprints, the letter, the seal, each is a thread, she murmured. Together they form a pattern. Someone sought to prevent Harold's threats from being realized. Someone capable of entering the cellar unnoticed. Someone desperate enough to act in the darkness. Graves followed her gaze. And we are close. Miss Marple smiled faintly. We are closer than any suspects. Shadows reveal more than faces, Inspector. And soon, the final pieces will fall into place. Chapter 18. Secrets Under the Floorboards. The evening was damp, with a mist curling along the village lanes. Miss Marple returned to the Redfern house alone, her mind alive with the threads of the case. The cellar had revealed much, the footprints, the scuff marks, the discarded letter, but she sensed one more secret remained hidden, small yet decisive. She carried a small lantern and knelt near the center of the cellar floor. The boards there were old, warped, and slightly raised in places. Gently tapping with her fingers, she noticed a hollow sound beneath one of them. Ah, she murmured. Curious. Using a flat tool from her knitting bag, one of the many implements she kept for odd purposes, she pried at the board. A small panel lifted, revealing a shallow cavity underneath. Inside lay a bundle, tied with a faded ribbon. She drew it out carefully. It was a collection of papers, letters, receipts, and a small notebook. Miss Marple spread them on the floor. Her eyes moved quickly, cataloging each detail. One letter, folded and worn, bore Harold's handwriting. Another, typed and signed with a familiar flourish, was clearly the same as the torn warning note found earlier. Reading through them, Miss Marple's lips pressed tightly together. Here, beneath the floorboards, lay a record of Harold's threats, observations, and blackmail attempts. It confirmed what she had suspected. Someone in the village had discovered the letter, feared its consequences, and acted in desperation. Her hand lingered on a particular notebook. Inside, the entries were careful, meticulous, almost obsessive. Dates, times, and observations were noted, each entry detailing interactions with villagers, debts owed, disputes, and rumored secrets. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "This is a record of intent," she murmured. "Not mere gossip, but preparation. The person who kept this, who wrote these entries, knew what they were doing. They knew Harold's movements, his threats, and the potential impact of the letter." Suddenly, a faint sound caused her to look up. The wind, or footsteps. She waited, motionless, until the noise faded. Alone, she continued examining the papers. One receipt stood out. Payment for a dark coat, delivered to Dr. Simon's surgery 3 days before Harold's death. The coat matched Elsie's description of the figure she saw in the cellar. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Aha! That explains the figure, the presence in the cellar, and the warning note. The coat conceals identity, yes, but it also connects the doctor to the scene more directly than he admitted. She read further in the notebook. One line caught her attention. "If Harold discovers Lydia's secret, he will destroy all. Must act before he speaks. The cellar is the place. Dark, hidden, perfect for control." Miss Marple set the notebook down. Everything was falling into place. The motive, the method, and the panic. Dr. Simon's concern for Lydia, his hurried movements, the shaky alibi, all aligned. The evidence under the floorboards had revealed not only the plan but also the human fear that had executed it. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, pondering the implications. The footprints, the discarded letter, the blood smear, and now the hidden notebook. Each clue confirmed what she had suspected. The death had not been random, but orchestrated by someone who feared exposure, yet acted without intending murder. "Secrets," she murmured, "may be hidden under floorboards, in cupboards, and in the hearts of men. But even the most carefully buried secrets have a way of speaking, eventually. And in Elmsworth, the echoes beneath the cellar would soon speak loudly enough for everyone to understand." Chapter 19. The Confrontation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the Redfern house, painting the walls in a golden-brown hue that belied the tension inside. Miss Marple and Inspector Graves had called Dr. Simons to the drawing-room, ostensibly to discuss medical affairs, but the true purpose was far graver. Dr. Simons entered tall and composed as ever, though the tight line of his mouth betrayed a subtle unease. He gave a courteous nod to Miss Marple and Inspector Graves, seating himself opposite them. "Doctor," Miss Marple began gently, "I trust you understand why we wish to see you." "Yes, I can imagine," he replied, his voice steady but wary. Miss Marple laid a hand over the hidden notebook she had brought from the cellar. "We have discovered several items that require explanation. The torn warning note, the bundle under the floorboards, and the receipt for a dark coat, purchased just days before Harold Trenchard's death." Dr. Simons's fingers clenched slightly around the arm of his chair. I've already told you everything I know." Inspector Graves leaned forward. Yet young Elsie saw a figure in the cellar the night of Harold's death. That figure held a piece of paper, then fled in haste. Footprints, scuff marks, and a blood smear confirm a struggle. "Doctor, we need the truth." Miss Marple's calm eyes met his. "Doctor, people act in fear, in desperation, in love, in greed. Harold's death has stirred more than grief in Elmsworth. It has revealed motives, intentions, and opportunities. We know someone confronted him in the cellar. Someone held a letter. Someone panicked. And, Doctor, the evidence points clearly in one direction." Dr. Simons swallowed, his jaw tightening. I followed Harold that night. I did not intend him harm. I only wished to prevent him from exposing Lydia's letter. I was concerned for her reputation. I confronted him in the cellar. I admit it. But when he argued, he tripped or perhaps stumbled. I did not push him. I swear I did not intend death. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her hand. "Fear makes accidents happen, Doctor. Yet it also forces people to hide, to obscure, to mislead. You did act in haste, and in that hasty moment, Harold fell and suffered fatal injury. That is clear. The question now is, will we face the truth openly, or will it remain hidden under shadows? The doctor's eyes filled with anguish. I panicked. I hid the notebook, the letters, the warning note. I tried to retrieve the letter after he fell. I did not know what to do. I feared discovery, feared ruin, feared scandal for Lydia. Inspector Graves set down his notebook. Doctor, confession now, fully and voluntarily, will weigh heavily in your favor. Hiding the truth only worsens matters. We are not here to punish without understanding. Miss Marple added gently. And consider, Doctor, the village has its eyes and ears open. Elsie's observation, the Cellar's clues, they will not lie. It is better to align with truth than with shadows. Dr. Simons bowed his head, the weight of guilt visible in every line of his face. Very well, he whispered. I admit it all. I confronted Harold over the letter. I feared its revelation would ruin Lydia. In the struggle he fell. I panicked, hid what I could, and returned home, hoping no one would discover the truth. But it was my actions, my fear, that set the events into motion. I take full responsibility. Miss Marple leaned back, her expression serene but commanding. It is not only the consequences of our actions, Doctor, but also our willingness to accept them that defines character. You acted in fear, yes, but confession is the first step toward remedy. We shall see that the law considers all circumstances. Inspector Graves nodded. Your full cooperation, Doctor, will be taken into account. You may have acted hastily, but your honesty now is vital. Dr. Simons exhaled, a weight lifted, though grief and remorse lingered. I only hope Harold can forgive, in whatever way that is possible. Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. Forgiveness, Doctor, comes more easily when one faces the truth. And now the village may find peace, knowing that secrets no longer govern our lives. As Dr. Simons left, escorted by the inspector, Miss Marple turned to gaze out the window. The sun had dipped lower, and the shadows of the Redfern house stretched long across the garden. Truth, she whispered to herself, is like the light, persistent, patient, and eventually impossible to conceal. Chapter 20. The Echo resolved. The village of Elmsworth had grown quiet once more, though not unchanged. Secrets that had lingered in shadows now lay exposed, and the air felt lighter, as if the truth itself carried a gentle cleansing. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane toward the Redfern house, reflecting on the events that had unfolded over the past weeks. Inside, Lydia Redfern moved about with a quiet dignity. Though grief still touched her features, there was relief in her eyes, tempered by the knowledge that the truth of Harold's death was finally understood. Miss Marple greeted her with a warm nod. Miss Marple, Lydia said softly, I hardly know how to thank you. Without your insight, I fear the fear and suspicion would have poisoned us all. Now, perhaps life can return to some semblance of peace. Miss Marple smiled, her calm demeanor reassuring. The past cannot be undone, my dear. But understanding it and facing it allows one to move forward. The echoes from the cellar, the secrets under the floorboards, they have spoken. And we have listened carefully. Inspector Graves arrived shortly afterward, his expression unusually gentle. Miss Marple, the doctor has fully confessed. The evidence, corroborated by young Elsie and the cellar clues, made clear what happened. Though his actions were in panic and ultimately led to Harold's tragic death, his honesty now ensures that justice can be tempered with understanding. Lydia's hand trembled as she reached for her tea. And the letter, the notebook, everything that Harold had feared. Miss Marple tapped her knitting needles thoughtfully. They will be archived, but the community now knows the worst of human fears and failings. Secrets that fester can be dangerous, but those that are addressed openly lose their power. Harold's threats no longer haunt Elmsworth. They have been resolved. Later, Miss Marple walked through the village, observing familiar faces with a keen eye. The baker smiled as he passed, the grocer waved from his shop, and children played in the lanes, unaware of the heavy events that had unfolded below the surface. Even the cellar at St. Luke's, once a place of whispers and shadows, seemed at peace. The footprints and scuff marks had been documented, the letters and notebooks secured. The dark coat that had concealed identity now belonged to history. Miss Marple paused, considering the human heart. Fear and secrecy, she murmured, echo long after the event, but honesty and courage quiet the echoes. And sometimes one must simply listen patiently for the truth to speak. In the weeks that followed, life in Elmsworth returned to its gentle rhythms. Gossip persisted, of course, but now tinged with understanding rather than accusation. The villagers, aware of the events surrounding Harold Trenchard's death, treated each other with a subtle caution, a respect for the complexity of human motives. Dr. Simons resumed his practice, his demeanor humbled but sincere. Lydia Redfern, supported by friends and family, began to rebuild her life with quiet resilience. And Miss Marple, as ever, watched and listened, her insight a gentle safeguard over the village she loved. The echoes from the cellar, once harbingers of fear and suspicion, had finally resolved. They had told their story, piece by piece, to the woman who could see patterns others missed. And in doing so they allowed Elmsworth to heal, not through punishment alone, but through understanding, honesty, and the patient uncovering of truth. Miss Marple paused at her own doorstep that evening, looking back toward the Redfern house. The sun set softly, casting a warm glow over the village lanes. She smiled faintly. "All is quiet now," she whispered. "But the lessons remain. Listen carefully, observe quietly, and never underestimate the echoes of human nature. They often tell more than words ever could."